Today I'm joined by Dr. Edward Hagen. He is a professor of evolutionary anthropology at Washington State University, where he runs the Bioanthropology lab and researches, among other things, evolutionary medicine, the evolution of leadership, and the evolution of substance use. Ed, welcome to the Nature and Nurture podcast.
Glad to be here. Glad
to have you here. So you're the first anthropologist I've had on the show, and I don't know too much about the field of anthropology, and I don't think I imagine some of my listeners might not either. So it would be great if you could give just a brief overview of what it is anthropologists do, and then we can talk about your research as well.
So anthropology is traditionally divided into 4 subdisciplines. The subdiscipline that most folks are probably familiar with is archaeology. And these are folks that study past human societies and cultures and past human behaviors. And they typically excavate material culture, everything from little scraps of pots or
they're like Indiana Jones.
They're kind of like the Indiana Jones. And actually, a lot of archaeologists got into archaeology because they were inspired by Indiana Jones. But we have a little bit of a love-hate relationship with him because a lot of it is looting and taking cultural artifacts out of context. So the scientific practices that we see in the Indiana Jones movies are pretty poor. Nevertheless, they are kind of inspiring movies in some ways. So that's one subdiscipline. Another subdiscipline that many folks might be familiar with is biological anthropology. That's what I am. And most of us in my discipline are paleoanthropologists. That means that we look at fossils of typically human ancestors, or we examine burials of modern humans, but ancient modern humans or historical modern human populations. So looking at skeletons and trying to infer their diet, their disease, their life ways from skeletal evidence. Another group of biological anthropologists study primates because we humans are primates. So they're attempting to kind of understand humans in the broader context of our close relatives like chimpanzees and gorillas and other primates. A third subdiscipline is linguistic anthropology. These folks study different languages, often indigenous languages, again, trying to understand the cultural evolution of language. And the final big subdiscipline is cultural anthropology. Those folks basically are trying to understand cultural diversity around the world. And they will often go and live in a particular culture. And really, we call this participant observation, really trying to understand cultures from the inside. And so today, as we kind of watch the disaster in Afghanistan, a lot of us anthropologists are shaking our heads because we could have predicted something like this. That society is very, very different from ours. That whole exercise would have benefited from some anthropological perspectives on the Afghan people. And that's what a lot of anthropologists have tried to do over the last literally 200 years is understand those kinds of societies, how they are similar and different to ours from the inside, kind of seeing the society from those folks' own perspective. So those would be the 4 subdisciplines. I'm a little bit odd. There's a group of us that are very interested in human behavior from an evolutionary perspective. So we have a lot in common with cultural anthropologists that are trying to understand human behavioral and cultural diversity. But we're trying to do it from an evolutionary perspective, using the kinds of theories that primatologists would often use to understand primate behavior and applying them to human behavior. So if we kind of think not just of our physiological and morphological evolution, for example, the evolution of our teeth or the evolution of bipedalism, we're trying to think about how do we understand the evolution of human behavior when we think about humans as primates. And there's not too many of us doing that, but there's a few.
That's a great overview, thank you. So were you initially drawn to this biological end, or were you like an undergrad exploring various disciplines and well, yeah, how did you become interested in biological anthropology?
Yeah, well, I was actually originally in the natural sciences. I'm a physics math major. I worked in chemistry for many years. But I realized I was more interested in humans than non-human things in the natural world. I was more interested in the social and human world. But I wanted to do that from a scientific perspective and a broad comparative perspective. How do we think about humans as one animal among many? And I was actually completely ignorant of most of the anthropology, but I knew that's kind of what I wanted to do. So I entered into anthropology originally as a cultural anthropologist. I entered in the early 90s. And at that time, cultural anthropology had been going through a crisis that really still hasn't recovered from. It had kind of divided into a scientific faction that really wanted to continue to study human behavior using scientific methods and principles. But there was another faction that was saying, look, indigenous peoples all around the world are really being hugely impacted by globalization and colonialism. And we can't just kind of dispassionately think about this from a scientific perspective. We got to get in there and help these folks whose cultures are being devastated. So the field was really grappling with what did it want to do. And I knew that I really believed that we couldn't really help people if we didn't understand them. So I really wanted to stay on the scientific side. And I was really drawn to the comparative perspective, thinking about humans as one primate among many. And I really thought that could offer us some keen insights. But a lot of cultural anthropology was pretty hostile to that approach and still is. So I decided to switch to biological anthropology, where there are folks that still are very interested in kind of trying to think about human behavior from an evolutionary scientific perspective.
So outside of the biological aspect, how does cultural anthropology differ from, let's say, how historians look at the evolution of culture?
Yeah, so historians typically rely on historical records. This requires written records. So they're very much focused on societies that have written historical records that they can look at, be they economic records or what have you. So there is a lot of overlap. In fact, cultural anthropologists in the early 90s and still today were actually being heavily influenced by historical approaches. So there is quite a bit of overlap, but many anthropologists work with non-literate folks. And unlike historians will often embed themselves and live in these societies for months and years, collecting data at the individual level from living people, from our informants. So the methodologies are different. The types of populations typically are different. But there is a fair amount of overlap and back and forth between historians and cultural anthropologists.
And living with the group and observing that comes to mind, like Jane Goodall living with the apes, right? So that's
exactly, yeah. In fact, yeah, a lot of those methods were kind of inspired by. So Jane Goodall does come out of it, and her advisors and the folks who were kind of encouraging in her and supporting her were inspired by a lot of methods of anthropology, and so there is quite a bit of conceptual connection between primatologists and cultural anthropologists in that, yes, close behavior, close observations of behavior are critical here. But most primatologists, unlike most cultural anthropologists, use an evolutionary framework. They're using evolutionary theories to try and understand primate behavior. And they're thinking about primates, again, as one mammal among a large group of mammals, among a large group of vertebrates, as one species of many on the planet. That would be very unlike most cultural anthropologists.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like it took longer to start taking an evolutionary approach to human behavior.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's even Darwin was the first to lay out evolutionary theory, of course, and he was very interested in human behavior. And so, actually, in his work, he does include observations of non-Western peoples in many of his arguments. So trying to understand human behavior from an evolutionary perspective is there from the beginning. But it's also been quite controversial. It really hasn't made too much inroads into much of cultural anthropology. There are several important exceptions, of course. But it has become the dominant framework in primatology. And so those of us who are interested in human behavior from an evolutionary perspective, we're still kind of struggling to make inroads. But I would say it's less controversial today. I think we've succeeded in convincing many folks that we have something to offer, even though I can't really downplay, there's still quite a bit of conflicting views, to be sure.
Mm-hmm. So one of the controversies with especially evolutionary psychology is that it seems like you can sort of craft a story with an evolutionary explanation, whichever way your finding is going. So how do you actually test things? Because it seems like you could have some phenomena with two opposite possible explanations, and one anthropologist might say something and one might say the opposite. How do you test which is true when you can't look back in time?
Yeah, well, this is, of course, a problem with just about all science. We always have multiple theories for the same phenomena, and how do we distinguish them? And it's very hard, you're absolutely right. And evolutionary psychologists are proposing that a lot of the psychology that generates our behavior evolved over long periods of time during human evolution. And so it does require us to make claims about the past. That's not so unusual. We were just talking about historians. They're studying the past. They're making claims about past behavior. We just talked about paleoanthropologists studying fossils. They're making claims about the past. If we think about paleontologists thinking about dinosaurs or extinct species, they're making claims about the past. So really, as scientists, all we can do is study the past. We can't really study the future. We can't collect data from the future. We can only collect data from the past. Sometimes it's the recent past, sometimes it's the distant past. And that's always a challenge. That's why science is challenging. So, but how can we make claims about past environments? We have a lot of evidence about past environments. We know that for the past 2 million years or so, or even longer, we know from fossil evidence, most species that we see today have been around in their current forms for several million years. We're not living in the age of the dinosaurs, we're living in the age of the mammals. Mammals have been around a long time. The plant life that we see today is not so different from the plant life we've seen in the past. The environments that we see today, the different kinds of biomes and ecologies are not radically different from those over the last several million years. They're pretty darn similar. There were always things like lakes and rivers and mountains and hills. So the kind of geography that our ancestors would have interacted with is pretty similar to what we see today. The kinds of plant life and animal life that our ancestors would have interacted with are pretty similar to what we see today. And there's always been parents and children. There's always been siblings. There's always been males and females. There's always been relatives and non-relatives and strangers. So the kinds of social interactions that we see today are not, dramatically mind-bending different from those that have also been present in our evolutionary past. And so we can really learn a lot about the past by learning about the present. It's not a horrible assumption to make that what we see today does represent patterns that would have been true in the past as a first approximation. Now, that won't always be the case. Things are going to shift. It's probably the case that in our evolutionary past, many more of us might have struggled to find food on a daily basis. We had to get our food ourselves. We couldn't just go to Safeway and easily get all of the food that we needed. We had to go gather it and hunt it. The kinds of threats that we see in our past might have been different. We probably would have suffered more from snake bites and spider bites than we do today. So there would have been differences, to be sure. But these are not intractable. They're not impossible to get at. And then what evolutionary psychologists want to do is say, okay, let's say we had a threat like spiders and snakes. Should that reflect itself in modern day psychology? And we can begin to see, do we have some kind of intrinsic ability to become afraid to learn fears of dangerous animals like toxic, poisonous spiders and snakes and scorpions? And we can test that. And is that universal? Do we see that in all humans? And we can even test it in our close relatives, primates. Do we see those kinds of fears easily being learned in our close primate relatives? So we can begin to look for universal patterns, things that would have shaped our psychology should be universal. We shouldn't just see them in this population and not that population. We should probably see them in all populations. And they should reflect really reasonable kinds of threats, for example, to our ancestors. And then we can test, are those things kinds of threats to primates that live in the wild today? Are they threats to other animals that live in the wild today? And we can look at physiological adaptations. We have all kinds of proteins and enzymes that detoxify venoms and toxins. Why would we have those if that wasn't the selection pressure in the past? So there's all kinds of ways we can get it. Is it hard? Yes. Is it impossible? No.
That's very cool. And there's also a lot of comparison to modern hunter-gatherer tribes, right?
Yeah, so that's another source of evidence from cultural anthropologists and behavioral ecologists and folks who study different cultures from an evolutionary perspective. A lot of folks have spent their entire careers studying the lifeways of modern hunter-gatherers because we know that our ancestors had to live by finding and hunting wild foods. So let's see how folks do that today. We can probably learn a lot about ancestral lifeways by studying the lifeways of modern hunter-gatherers. Absolutely.
So let's go back to your PhD as you were making the transition from cultural to biological anthropology. What did you decide to study?
Well, I was always I was always interested in mental health. And this is actually kind of what got me into anthropology. To begin with, I was pretty skeptical of the biomedical approach to mental health that became popular in the 1980s. It's all chemical imbalances, and we can just pop a pill and that will fix everything. Because what I saw is that folks who were struggling with depression were struggling with real serious life problems. It wasn't just like you woke up one day and you're depressed out of the blue. They had serious conflicts with parents, with mates, with spouses, with siblings, with colleagues. So I felt that the relationship between very common mental health issues like depression really had to be related to the sorts of struggles that folks were seeing in their daily life. And I thought to understand that, we really need to take a pan-human approach. We need to think about our evolution and what kinds of things might have shaped the processes that end up with folks getting depressed over X, Y, and Z. So I was interested in mental health, but I really wanted to take a scientific and pan-human. I didn't want to just look at undergrads in the United States. I really thought we need to understand this very broadly. So as I was thinking about how to do this, it became clear to me that I thought evolutionary theory would be the best framework to tackle this issue. And the folks who were doing that actually coincidentally were a group of anthropologists at UC Santa Barbara, where I was getting my PhD, that were some of the pioneers in applying evolutionary theory to human psychology and human behavior.
So I've heard about sort of, I guess this might be more pop psych, but evolutionary theories saying something like part of the reason that depression rates are skyrocketing is because our lives are so easy now. So we're not facing the same struggles that we were sort of built for, I guess. Do you think there's any merit to that?
Yeah, that's called the mismatch hypothesis. And actually, there's not much evidence that depression rates are skyrocketing. They've been pretty flat for as long as we've been measuring them at the population level. So you always hear, depression rates are going up or down, but really, if we look back over the last couple decades, they really haven't been changing much.
That's really good to know. Why do you think people think that it's going up?
Yeah, I don't know why. There's, again, we scientists are like everybody else, and we want to make our research seem important. So part of the reason that folks for a while thought that depression rates were really skyrocketing, and I think this sort of misimpression still has lasted, even though more recent research has more or less disproved it. But there was a new method we really started doing these doing large population surveys of mental health is relatively recent. We really only started doing this since the 1980s, in the last couple decades. And as part of that, folks would say, they would ask all kinds of questions. Are you, depressed today? But then they would ask retrospectively, have you ever been depressed in your life, to get lifetime? So if you're talking to a 20-year-old, you might say, have you ever been, depressed previously in your life? And they might say yes or no. And then you might ask a 60-year-old the same question. And what they found is they were getting the same rate of past depressions in the 20-year-olds as the 60-year-olds. Well, that would then lead you to conclude if at 20 you have this risk, the same risk as a 60-year-old today of having been depressed in the past, you would erroneously conclude that depression rates must be skyrocketing if a 20-year-old has had the same rate of past depression as somebody who's lived 3 times as long. So that method led a lot of folks to conclude that depression rates must be really, really skyrocketing if 20-year-olds are really having as much past depression as 60-year-olds. But we now strongly suspect that pattern is really due to biases in recall, that it's really not the case that a 20-year-old has the same number of past depressions as a 60-year-old. And so when better methods were implemented, folks realized no, that inference is probably due to recall bias and not an actual increase in depression rates. Nonetheless, that finding really kind of captured the popular imagination. It was probably good at getting grants to fund your research, to claim that there's this big giant crisis. So it is true that depression is very, very common, but it's been common for a long time.
That makes a lot of sense. So did you know that when you decided to go and study mental health? Because I could imagine that if you were growing up hearing that it's a crisis, that could be more motivating than if you hear, actually it's been pretty stable.
Yeah, that actually wasn't a factor. That was something I kind of learned later. For me, it was really the theoretical approach. Should we really think of depression as a chemical imbalance, as a dysfunction of the brain, that your brain is dysfunctioning? And that really did not make intuitive sense to me when I saw that in the case of depression, that these really severe psychological pain that people were going through was related to real life struggles. It wasn't just that their brain chemistry was screwing up. They were dealing with really, really tough problems. And so what I wanted to understand is, can we understand depression in relationship to genuine adversity? And what would be a solid evolutionary hypothesis for the relationship between psychological pain and genuine severe adversity? And so for me, the chemical imbalance story that was really pushing Prozac and other simple chemical approaches to treating depression really did not make much sense, and I didn't buy it. But I thought, what is the right? If that's wrong, and is it wrong, what's the right hypothesis? And I think there's quite a bit of agreement now that the chemical imbalance story is wrong. We really don't know. There's now quite a bit of research that antidepressants, they work really well, but placebos also work really well. And so the problem with antidepressants is not that they don't work well, they really do, but they don't work very much better than placebos, if at all.
That's interesting. So the placebo might be like you're getting help, and that's all you need to feel like you're getting help.
I think that's kind of my hypothesis, that if you get the placebo, you now are getting, and that's kind of our general approach, my colleagues and I, to depression, is that it is a cry for help. And so once you get the help, that is going to make you feel better. But it's not, it's not a quick fix. It's not an easy fix. You're dealing with genuine adversity, and it's not easy to diminish that diversity. That diversity is there for real reasons, and it's tough to get folks out of it in many cases.
So how about this mismatch hypothesis we talked
oh yeah
about?
yeah so the mismatch hypothesis, I think, is a solid hypothesis. Our environment is different than that of our ancestors. We live in huge cities. We're often separated from our close family. And so during our evolutionary history, it's been pretty rare that you wouldn't have been surrounded. So if I go into my classroom today and I ask folks to raise their hand, how many have a relative in the classroom here? Almost nobody will raise their hand. If anybody, it's really rare to get anybody to raise their hand for that question. But if we went back a few thousand years, or a few tens or hundreds of thousands of years, asking the same question, everybody would raise their hand. Everybody was living with close kin. And we have good evolutionary reasons to believe that our relationships with close kin are going to be qualitatively different than our relationships with folks we are not related to. So that would be a huge difference that could easily play into our experience of adversity or not. If you have a lot of people that are related to you, they may well be motivated to help you in a way that strangers are not. And so, in fact, some of the early studies of how do other people respond to depression. So if you're depressed, how do other people respond to that? Well, in fact, one of the most influential studies of that was in college students and their roommates. And so if a college student is depressed, the roommates kind of try and help, but they get fed up pretty quickly, and they find it aversive. Of course, your college roommate might have known you for a few weeks or a few months at most. They're not really invested in your life. And so that cry for help, if we're right, that a lot of depression is a cry for help, is going to fall on deaf ears for people who really aren't connected to you in some way. But if you're living with close kin, that cry for help might receive a very different kind of reception. And our story is more complicated than that, but that is an example of a mismatch where we might be in environments where our cries for help go unheeded because they're falling on deaf ears, essentially. That's a hypothesis. We don't necessarily have evidence for or against that, but that would be the kind of ways that mismatched environments, evolutionarily novel environments, could play into a lot of mental health struggles that folks are dealing with. And of course, during the pandemic, we're all social distancing and isolating. And that, I've been very lucky during the pandemic because I'm married, I've got my kids, they're young kids that are at home. My mother-in-law lives right down the street. So my social environment hasn't really changed. In fact, it's improved in some ways. I get to hang out with my kids a lot more than I normally did. Other folks, like my own grad students, they're in a college town, they're living by themselves in their apartment, they don't have family around, and so their experience of the pandemic has been dramatically different. That's basically day after day of social isolation and just connecting with folks on Zoom, and it's been pretty hard for them.
Right. So this family investment, is it like a biological thing, or does it just have to do with you're raised with these people and you know them so much longer than you know your roommate, and that's why the investment comes in? I guess you'd answer that by comparing adopted families with adopted children with biological children.
Yeah, and that's a very good study design that you just proposed there. In fact, if you just interviewed Deborah Lieberman, that's one of her whole areas of research is how do we recognize our kin? And a lot of Deborah's research has been, to what extent does growing up with somebody tell you that they're your kin? And it really influences a lot of our behaviors. And yes, so it's a combination of the two, that there are solid biological reasons to invest more heavily in kin because we share genes from a recent common ancestor. And so evolutionary theory is that the kinds of genetic variants that are going to be positively selected are those that increase the reproduction of that genetic variant, standard natural selection story. But if I've got a genetic variant, my sister's got it too, probably with 50% chance, and my parents have it, and my kids have it. And so the evolutionary theory called kin selection is that genetic variants often can increase their own reproduction by causing the folks that have them to invest in close relatives like siblings and offspring.
I remember this quote by some evolutionary biologist, and he said, "I'd gladly sacrifice my life for 2 brothers or 8 cousins."
Exactly. So that's Haldane, and that's a very famous quote, and that's exactly the right logic. So we do think there's a strong biology of kin altruism or kin selection that gives us intrinsic motivations to help kin that might not exist for strangers. But if in an evolutionarily novel environment we grew up, so if for some reason my parents adopted my sister but never told me, I would never know that, and I would think she's my biological sister. And that would trigger all of my psychology of kin investment exactly as if she was my genuine biological sibling. And she is my genuine biological sibling, but just to illustrate. And there have been some interesting studies of that where kids who were intended to be married as adults were raised together as kids. And there's quite a bit of evidence that that causes a lot of problems, because the last person you want to have sex with is your sibling. And so if you grow up with that person, you're raised with them since childhood, you're going to really view them as a more of a sibling or close genetic relative rather than a potential mate. So there is some evidence from exactly the kind of study design that you propose that actually does happen.
Yeah, that makes sense. So how did you switch your focus from mental health to evolutionary medicine?
Well, of course, mental health is one of the big branches of medicine. In fact, talking about mismatches, and then leaving the pandemic aside, we've really made a lot of progress. And I mean, we see this in the pandemic too, in treating infectious diseases and reducing infectious diseases. So if you went back even just 100 years or so, there'd be a 50-50 chance that you would die from an infectious disease. Today, again, pandemic aside, most folks in high-income countries will not die of an infectious disease. You will not die in childhood. So in the past, at least 50% of kids died in childhood. So almost half of all humans that have ever lived didn't make it into adulthood due to infectious disease. Today, at least in high-income countries, in middle-income countries, almost everybody will, due to sanitation and vaccines and antibiotics. And what that means is that mortality and morbidity are not coming as much from infectious disease as they used to, but instead from cancer and heart disease and mental health conditions. So today, mental health problems are some of the largest burden of disease burden worldwide, but also especially in high-income countries where disease burden from infectious disease is much reduced. So mental health problems are medical problems. And so I was always doing evolutionary medicine. It wasn't a switch.
Yeah, I was wondering the other day about the balance between, like, sanitation obviously saves lives and is hugely helpful, but if things are overly sanitary, you're going to have a weaker immune system.
Yeah, and there's a ton of research on that in evolutionary medicine, because we see a lot of the disease burden we see today is not from infectious diseases, but from autoimmune disorders, diabetes, obesity. A lot of folks think is related to immune problems, allergies. And so there's all these diseases that are chronic diseases that seem to be related to our immune system in the absence of pathogens. And that is one of the leading hypotheses, that if we were living in an ancestral environment, almost all of us would have intestinal worms. We would have all been hit with a large number of different kinds of infectious diseases. And we have very solid evidence that if you grow up infected with intestinal worms, your immune systems are intrinsically different. You're producing very, very high levels of immunoglobulin E, for example. So I would have very, very low levels. Even if I got infected with worms, my IgE would jump up, but it would go back down. But if you take anybody from a population that where worm infections are endemic, even if they're not infected with worms, they're producing very high levels of IgE. So your immune system is really calibrated quite differently if you're living in an environment that more closely resembles our ancestral pathogen environment. And that leads a lot of folks, it's a lot stronger, exactly. It's been activated. And a lot of folks think that, and this is called the hygiene hypothesis, that our hygienic environments that we live in, at least in high-income countries today, our immune systems are not being calibrated properly, and they're overly sensitive. They're turning on when they shouldn't, and causing all kinds of autoimmune disorders. And there's a ton of research on that. Exactly how that works, and if that is the right hypothesis, I would say we still don't know, but it's one that has been very heavily researched, and there's quite a bit of evidence for it.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. It's a very interesting line of research. So your work on substance use, did that relate to mental health? Were you looking at like evolutionary models for, I mean, I wouldn't say the first antidepressants, but that's kind of what I want to say.
Yeah, so drug addiction, of course, is considered to be a mental health problem. So it's solidly in the area of mental health research. Mm-hmm. And I actually got into this with a colleague of mine, Roger Sullivan, who we were two of the very few folks looking at mental health conditions from an evolutionary perspective. I was focusing more on depression. Roger was focusing more on schizophrenia. But what we both knew is that folks with mental health issues are very heavy drug users. And that's particularly true with schizophrenics. They use a lot of drugs. And Roger's idea, and one of the ideas out there, is that the reason for that is you're self-medicating your symptoms. And so we began to think about how do we think about this heavy drug use among schizophrenics and other folks struggling with mental health issues. How do we understand this heavy drug use and the self-medication that seems to be going on? And Roger actually has some studies showing that the types of drugs that schizophrenics typically use match their symptom profiles. So that is evidence in favor of this kind of self-medication hypothesis. And again, we took an evolutionary approach, and our big question was, what are these drugs? Where are they coming from? And they're coming from plants. Almost all of the popular recreational drugs are from plants. And not only are they from plants, they are plant defensive chemicals. Nicotine, THC, cocaine, opium, caffeine. These are all substances that are produced by plants to deter herbivores. They're plant toxins, and they're deadly. When we think about nicotine and tobacco, we think about these long-term health problems like lung cancer and heart disease that show up decades after decades and decades of smoking. But when we think about, well, what is nicotine? Well, it's why is tobacco producing nicotine? And there's actually enough nicotine in a single leaf of a tobacco plant, a big bit of a leaf of tobacco plant, to kill you. Nicotine is an extraordinarily deadly neurotoxin that can easily kill you in minutes. And tobacco is producing that neurotoxin, not to support your smoking habit, but to defend itself from insect herbivores and deer and other animals that would want to eat that nice, otherwise tasty, large green leaf. And so Roger and I thought we need to really think about drugs from that perspective. These are plant defensive chemicals. Why would it be the case that all of us are, and not just mental health patients, are motivated to literally on a daily basis. I just finished my cup of coffee, as did literally millions and millions of people around the world. A lot of folks wake up and they have a cigarette or a cup of tea, or maybe they smoke a joint. And we all do this in some areas of the world. In Asia and the Pacific, folks would be consuming betel nut. um, all of us almost on a daily basis are deliberately ingesting tiny quantities of extremely dangerous plant neurotoxins that if we consume them in large quantities would kill us in minutes in many cases. Mm-hmm. So that was this challenge we were dealing with. How do we understand this? Let's put away all of the kind of standard theories of drug use that are non-evolutionary, and let's start with the origins of these drugs as plant defensive chemicals. And let's think about the fact that we have been eating plants, not just for decades or centuries, but really since almost the beginning of time. We have a very, very, very long and deep evolutionary history with plants, and that means we've been exposed to these substances forever. So we can't really easily think about our propensity to consume these substances as some kind of evolutionary novelty, which unfortunately was the way that most folks had been thinking about drug use and still think about drug use today.
So it seems like a huge paradox that these substances are toxic, but not only do we like them, they can be addictive in some cases.
Yeah, and that is exactly what we call, you're absolutely right, the paradox of recreational drug use. Why, or the paradox actually is, as we call it, paradox of drug reward. Why do we find these deadly toxins rewarding? And actually, initially, most of us don't. So the data are really overwhelmingly clear that there's almost no drug use among children. So roughly from 0 to 10, there's no drug use. Kids are not waking up and having a cup of black coffee. They're not lighting up a cigarette. They're not smoking a joint. They're not taking a shot of vodka. And then there's a universal, very rapid switch-like transition in adolescence where we go from consuming no drugs to deliberately consuming almost on a daily basis some kind of neurotoxic compound. And we all undergo that transition pretty much in adolescence. And the substance might be alcohol, it might be nicotine, it might be caffeine, some combination of all those. For some folks, marijuana, and actually the harder drugs are use of those is pretty rare, but of course some folks do transition to cocaine use. And it's perplexing because, as we just discussed, these things are deadly toxins. So why would we, and so it makes that, so the child behavior makes a lot of sense. Kids are avoiding these deadly toxins. And yeah, that's what we should all be doing. And yet we all transition to consumption of small quantities of these deadly toxins on a daily basis. Why? It is very, very paradoxical. And as you point out, it becomes addicting. And I would kind of prefer to call it habitual.
Yeah.
We're habitually using these things, and it's not just true for a few of us, it's true for all of us. And so why is that?
So this might be related. When I was a kid, I was much more sensitive to not liking bitter things, as most kids are. And now, so I wouldn't eat dark chocolate, for example. And now I prefer dark chocolate to milk chocolate. And it seems like that's a switch that happens as towards adulthood, like you mentioned.
Exactly, and you're absolutely right. This is a very similar switch that any of us who have been kids and can remember our childhood, or our parents, and we're trying to get our own kids to eat their vegetables, it's a struggle. Kids don't like green leafy vegetables, typically. They don't like bitter foods. They don't like spices. And so there's a lot of neophobia and pickiness, and it is related to bitterness and toxicity. And much more directed at plant foods than meat, for example, or sugary foods. And then yes, in adolescence, there is a switch as folks begin now to broaden their diets, become more open to spicier foods, as you say, dark chocolate. My kids really love, my young kids, the milk chocolate. But my wife and I much prefer, the 70% or 80% chocolate that has a lot less sugar and a lot more of the bitter cocoa in it. So that is, again, a transition that happens in adolescence. So what's going on there? That's the big question that we've been tackling.
Right. So what have you found about this paradox of habitual use?
So what we are our hypothesis is, yes, we're deliberately consuming these toxins, and we don't just do it. Many people may not think of this, but I think the example you just brought up is the perfect one. Drugs like tobacco and marijuana and coffee are very, very similar to spices, pepper, onions. These are all plant substances that are high in toxins, and we avoid them in childhood. So why do we avoid them? Well, and why so much in childhood? Well, in childhood, we're undergoing extremely rapid development, especially our brain. So why is tobacco producing nicotine? Well, nicotine is a neurotoxin. It interferes with brain functions, with neural functions. It attacks a specific neural receptor called the nicotinic acetylcholine receptor. That receptor does many things in our body, but one of the most important things it does is it allows our brains to control our muscles. So when you move any muscle, your neurons are releasing a special neurotransmitter called acetylcholine, and that then stimulates your muscle. That's how your brain tells your muscles to move. Well, nicotine binds to that receptor. In fact, it was discovered, that's how that receptor was discovered and why it's called the nicotinic acetylcholine receptor. And tobacco is producing nicotine because those receptors are widespread, not just in our bodies, but in the bodies of almost all animals. It's a very ancient neural receptor. And so nicotine interferes with that signaling. And if you can't tell your heart to beat or your lungs to breathe, you're in deep trouble. So it's no surprise that that tobacco plants, to protect themselves, are producing that stuff. And that's why we think kids are avoiding all these bitter substances, that their bodies and brains are developing rapidly. And for that development to occur properly, you have to avoid substances that interfere with neural signaling, like nicotine, caffeine, THC, cocaine, ethanol. So we think kids are basically protecting the developments of their own brains and bodies by being averse to neurotoxic substances. So a big part of our story is not to explain why people are using these drugs, but to explain why some groups of individuals are avoiding these drugs. And kids are one of the big groups that really have a very strikingly effective avoidance of all these substances.
So then the question is if this is protective, why doesn't it stay throughout the lifespan?
And why doesn't it stay? And to some extent it does stay, because we see significantly lower drug use in women of reproductive age. While they're adults, why are they not using drugs just like all other adults? Well, they do, but they use it less. And we think it's because during their reproductive years, women can become pregnant, and so they're not protecting their own development, which is already largely complete, but the potential development of a fetus. So we call this the fetal protection hypothesis. So a large part of our research is to understand and test the ideas that kids and women of reproductive age are avoiding drugs to a greater or lesser extent to protect either their own development or the development of the developing offspring of fetus. So that's one big area of our research. Now, the other question is, why does everybody transition to use, including men and women in adolescence, and then women kind of drop off from their 20s and 30s, and then they actually, once they're done with their childbearing years, drug use in women tends to go up a little bit. Once the risk to potential developing fetus is no longer there. So that is the big question. And the idea is that, well, maybe plants are producing these substances to defend themselves from things that eat plants. And those are things like insects and other arthropods, viruses, bacteria, worms. And so Roger and my idea was, maybe we're using these toxins to defend ourselves against those same things, because the same things that infect and eat plants infect and eat us. And so, as I mentioned earlier in the interview here, in the past, we were regularly infected with intestinal worms. Turns out plants are also infected with worms. Root nematodes are a really major risk to a lot of plants. So plants are producing lots of toxins to kill worms. And maybe those toxins that plants are producing to defend themselves against the things that eat plants would also protect us against the things that eat us, because broadly they're the same things. And it turns out there's a lot of evidence, not just in humans, but other animals, that many, many other animals co-opt plant toxins to treat their own infections. So we can begin to think of plants not just as sources of food or sources of deadly toxins, but as sources of pharmaceuticals. Over human evolution, all of those plants out there were not only a supermarket, they were also a pharmacy. And there's quite a bit of evidence in other animals that other animals, when they get sick, will deliberately ingest toxic plants to kill their own pathogens. And so the idea here is that toxic plant substances, be they spices in food, be they psychoactive drugs, or be they traditional medicines, which are also basically plant-based, the kinds of medicines that we would find in modern hunter-gatherers, for example. These are all plant substances. They all contain high concentrations of plant toxins, and they may be killing our own pathogens. So the hypothesis that we're working on is that once our brains are mostly developed, and our brains are pretty much developed, fully developed. There's a lot of development that goes on in adolescence, but by age around 10, your brain is almost adult size. And so the risk of disrupting brain development begins to decrease in adolescence, but you're now being exposed to lots of new pathogens. And so our hypothesis is that over human evolution, folks began to increase their consumption of plant pharmaceuticals, essentially. We're basically self-medicating against the kinds of things that would have begun to infect us: worms, insect arthropods. A lot of diseases, of course, are transmitted by things like ticks and mites and mosquitoes, and nicotine kills those things very, very effectively. So our hypothesis that we're working on is that recreational drug use is actually a way of protecting ourselves against a whole variety of pathogens.
That makes a lot of sense.
At least it would have in the evolutionary past.
That's super interesting. So it's kind of like chemotherapy, where it's like it's this deadly radiation, but it's deadlier for the cancer than for you.
Exactly. All medicines are dangerous, and that's why we often, in modern societies, we have laws that we can't just go to the pharmacy and get anything we want. We have to get most of our drugs in consultation with experts who then figure out, is this drug going to help you? Because those drugs are toxins and they can be very dangerous. And what dose do you need to precisely do more harm to a pathogen than it will do to you? And so that's exactly, but that challenge is not just a challenge of modern societies. That's been a challenge for us since day one. And so what we're arguing is, yes, that humans, we have our own mechanisms, our own psychological mechanisms to exactly regulate and titrate small quantities of these toxins that will be more deadly to our pathogens than they will be to us. And it's important it's a very tricky problem, because as I mentioned earlier, there's easily enough nicotine in a single large leaf of tobacco to kill you if you ate the whole thing at once. So what we have to do when we're smoking tobacco is just take in just enough to potentially kill some pathogens that we have, but not so much that we hurt ourselves. And when we study smokers, what we see is that they're very, very good at keeping their blood levels of nicotine pretty tightly regulated. And so there's been a lot of very interesting experiments where they'll take smokers and they will either give them cigarettes that have been, where the nicotine content has been reduced or increased. And in the cases where folks are traded for cigarettes with less nicotine, people then begin to smoke more and inhale more to increase their nicotine levels. Or if you give them cigarettes with higher levels of nicotine, they downregulate their smoking so that they maintain a relatively constant level of nicotine. And that level that they maintain is just below the level at which you're going to start to get violently ill. So it looks like we have very highly tuned mechanisms to regulate nicotine intake, right up to the level where we would almost be vomiting violently, but not quite. So we're maximizing the toxicity level that we can tolerate, at least our hypothesis, to kill pathogens that might have been infecting us over our evolutionary history.
Yeah. Is it reasonable to suppose that once upon a time, we always hated the feeling that these drugs would give us, but then over evolutionary spans of time, we started like getting a buzz or starting to enjoy the feeling like people describe, precisely because it became adaptive for us.
Yeah, and we think that the evolutionary history of this goes back even farther, because we see in chimpanzees that they don't obviously smoke cigarettes, but they do ingest toxic plants. They do seem to be interested in psychoactive substances in the same way that we are. And the challenges, of course, of being infected by a pathogen go way, way back in time. So we kind of view that similar kinds of behaviors and mechanisms probably have a pretty deep evolutionary history. But yes, and in fact, if you look at, anybody who has ever smoked a cigarette probably remembers their first one, and then you probably felt pretty sick. That was certainly my first experience ever smoking a cigar. I was like, oh God, never want to do that again. But then, of course, you will do it again. So what we see is that people initially have a kind of a negative reaction to their first exposure to any of these drugs. That's understandable. They are deadly neurotoxins. And you would think that would be the end of it. First bad experience. And that's, of course, our experience with food poisoning. If we get food poisoning at a restaurant, we're not going back to that place again. But it's not the way we react to these drugs, very interestingly. And that's part of our theory here, is that, yeah, you're going to have a kind of a negative sick reaction. That's your body defending itself against a toxin. But at the same time, we think your body's recognizing this could be a potential medicine as well. So yeah, you had too much to begin with, but this is now a candidate medicine that you might need in the future. So you should begin to locate sources of this. You should begin to experiment. How much of it can you tolerate? What are its effects? Does it actually maybe help you feel better in certain situations? So we think there's going to be kind of a psychology of drug experimentation, where folks are going to be, once they enter adolescence, are going to be paying attention to what are these sources of psychoactive substances in my environment? Which ones can I tolerate? How much of it can I tolerate? How does it affect me? And so there's going to be a period during adolescence of drug experimentation where you're basically learning how to self-medicate safely with these substances.
Is the biological mechanism, is it more like your body recognizes the substance and then thinks I can use this? Or is it more like you're recognizing an association between I just took this and now all of a sudden all the bad bacteria just died?
Yeah. We don't know. And that's a great question. And both of those could be true. Because it has to be the case that you're looking for potential medicines, potential pharmaceuticals that you might need in the future. And so that's going to require a lot of sampling and kind of being aware of the psychological and physiological effects of these things. But you also want to know, does it do anything? Does it work? And that would be associating a feeling of illness then disappearing on the consumption of some of these substances. Hey, I was feeling kind of sick yesterday, or I had a lot of worms, and now I take this stuff and suddenly my body's flushing out worms, because that's actually what happens. In fact, farmers used to deworm their livestock with nicotine, and they give a concentrate. They take a bunch of tobacco and kind of soak it in a bucket of water. In fact, around the world, in kind of rural, low-income countries today, that's still a common practice. Later, they would use things like nicotine sulfate, feed it to their goats and cattle. And then shortly thereafter, the livestock poop out a whole big mass of worms. So you might just notice, hey, I just ate this plant. It kind of made me feel kind of buzzed, and now I'm pooping out all my worms. I'm going to try that again. And in fact, with the hunter-gatherer populations that I've worked with, they have a plant they call matunga. And I was actually they smoke a lot of tobacco and marijuana. And so I was asking them, are there any traditional plants that you smoked? And they say, oh yeah, we smoke matunga. And I smoked some, and it was very much like smoking a cigarette. You got the same kind of slight buzz. So I asked them, is there anything else you do with matunga? Oh yeah, we treat our worms with it. And so they don't treat their worms by smoking matunga, but they make a tea out of it. When they think they have worms, they notice some eggs in their poop or some worms, and then they drink this tea of matunga. It's a local plant, and it causes the worms to get expelled. So yes, we think there would be these feedback mechanisms, probably both. What kinds of substances could be potential pharmaceuticals, and then which ones do we actually have evidence actually work against this specific kind of infection. At least those would be our hypotheses, but we've still got a long way to go to see if that's actually what's going on. But those are, that's kind of where we're starting right now. Yes.
Do we have any idea how people discover these? Like whether it's with drug use, and especially when there's a lot of preparation involved, or even things like cheese making or alcohol fermentation, all of it, it seems like so unlikely that those things would be discovered.
I know, it's really remarkable, and especially because you're right, it's not, if it was just, and in a lot of cases it's going to be as simple, this plant made me feel better against this. But in other cases, it's a combination. So just to give an example, in traditional Chinese medicine, they recommend using areca seeds and pumpkin seeds to get rid of particular kinds of worms. How did they figure out that combination? And there's actually now been controlled studies. Is it true that areca seeds and pumpkin seeds? So in a controlled study, researchers took areca seeds versus worms and pumpkin seeds versus worms, and their combination versus worms. And it turned out the combination was better than either one alone, that there was a synergistic interaction between these two. How the heck did they figure that out? How long did that take? And we don't really know. It is a lot of times these concoctions are kind of elaborate, cooking this, mixing that. How did folks figure out that complex combination actually did work against this specific problem? It's a great question. We don't know the answer to that, but that is one of the things we're very, very interested in.
Yeah, it's very cool. All right, so if you have the time, the last thing I want to ask you about is your work on leadership.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I've got time.
Okay, great. So yeah, how did you get involved in studying that, and what have you done, and what have you found?
Yeah, so many years ago, as I was a grad student, I read this paper by a geneticist, James Neal. He's actually considered one of the fathers of American genetics. He was one of the first folks actually to go into Hiroshima after the atomic bombs to try and figure out how, radiation was affecting folks. He wanted to understand, again, he was interested in the kinds of things we've been talking about here today, not just how do humans reproduce today, but what was the structure of reproduction over human evolution. And so he was one of the first that recognized we really need to study the few folks surviving today that still live traditional lifestyles by hunting and gathering or horticulture. So he started working with indigenous native South Americans and really recording who is marrying who's having kids, how many kids is each woman producing, how many kids is each man producing. And he discovered a really striking pattern that in these indigenous Native American, Native South American, Amazonian groups, relatively few men were producing most of the kids. So the distribution of reproduction across women was pretty even and consistent. But there were relatively few men who were fathering most of the children, and those men were leaders in the group. So there was this striking differential reproduction by leadership. And being a geneticist, he realized that is a really striking pattern. Why is it that men who are leaders are much more successful and much more at producing offspring, i.e. getting mates, than other men? And he began to think of what would be the evolutionary consequences of that. And he realized that whatever traits would have allowed men to become leaders in these kinds of societies would have been traits that would have been under very strong positive natural selection, because by ascending to a leadership position, you then were much more successful at getting wives and therefore having offspring. So he began to think, what is it about, what traits are being positively selected here? And he proposed that it's intelligence, that men are choosing other men that they consider to be making good decisions, are smart, are capable, really exemplify the values of that particular community. Those are the ones that often rise to leadership positions. So he wasn't viewing these leaders as aggressive, dominant individuals. He was viewing them as a kind of respected decision makers and good hunters. And they were the ones, so he was thinking that this might help explain the dramatic increase in human brain size over the last couple of million years, because Neil knew that if we go back in time about 2 million years, our brains are about the size of chimpanzee brains. So what was it that caused this increase in brain size in humans and not other animals? And so Neil began thinking it has something to do with leadership and the kinds of qualities that everybody values, both men and women value in leaders. And he didn't view it as the kind of intelligence that we might think of today, high IQ. He kind of viewed it as the kinds of intelligence that would really have been useful in these kinds of communities over evolutionary time, getting food, solving political problems, keeping everybody safe. But then his idea was lost. People forgot about it. But I always thought this is a really good idea because I knew that he was right. And since we now have a lot more evidence that Neil was right, that men who are high status and leaders in their communities do have more wives than other men and do have more offspring than other men. So that was a very strongly supported empirical fact. And Neil's logic, I thought, was very good, that these men do have traits. Since I've worked in a lot of these communities myself, these men are often highly respected by everybody. They're respected by their male peers, they're respected by the women. So I began to get interested in reviving Neil's idea here and beginning to think about how leadership might play into the evolutionary story of humans. And specifically the evolution of our very, very large brains.
So the idea is it's like a runaway sexual selection towards
it's a little bit like yes, it's kind of it's definitely a sexual selection argument, absolutely. But it's a different kind of sexual selection argument than people have been considering. So one of the common sexual selection arguments is women, that it's a good genes argument, that we're showing off our good genes with fancy stories and good jokes and using fancy language. So it's kind of a show-off hypothesis. And Neil's is a very different hypothesis, that these leaders are providing genuine benefits to everybody in the community that everybody values. But he didn't fully develop his theory. So yes, it is a sexual selection theory. And so my grad student, now a PhD himself, Zachary Garfield, began pouring through the ethnographic record was Neil right? He only observed a few Amazonian groups, but do these patterns really hold? And in fact, yes, they do. Being seen as intelligent and knowledgeable and having expertise is indeed a cross-cultural universally valued trait among leaders. And yes, indeed, these folks are often more likely to get wives than their followers.
So another question is that just a marker for overall fitness, or is this some quality that exists independently of like fitness?
Yeah, and that is a great question. So a lot of folks would say, well, yes, of course, these guys are physically healthy, they're smart, that's good for them. Women are attracted to that because it is a sign of genetic quality and fitness. Maybe these men can produce more resources. That's a story that's been out there for a long time. So they can provision mates. And we think, those are solid hypotheses, absolutely. But we wondered, is there something about the leadership role itself that is valuable? And the way we're thinking about this is that good decision-making is hard. and that folks actually genuinely value people that can make decisions for the group that improve everybody's outcomes in the group. And that this ability is very, very highly valued, so that it's not just an overall indicator of fitness, but that the specific skill of good decision making is actually a highly valued trait. And it's one that is valuable to the men in the group. For following that guy, we all kind of got to agree on which, on a decision here as a group. Are we going to go this way? Are we going to go that way? Are we going to go to war? Are we going to not go to war? Are we going to hunt here or hunt there, or move here this season or move there that season? These are really, really tough decisions. And so folks who year after year, decade after decade, make good decisions, ones that resulted in benefits for everybody, that's a very, very valuable thing. And it's valuable inside the family. We raise kids in families, and both men and women both are going to be very attracted to good decision makers, people who make decisions that result in good outcomes for not only them, but for your kids, for you, for other people in the group. So we think there may have been specific selection for good decision making by this process, the sexual selection process. And so that's kind of our contribution to Neil's idea here is that good decision making, not only by, and we think it actually may have started in women, because women have these cognitively immature offspring that can't make any decisions for themselves initially, and only gradually acquire the ability to make all kinds of life decisions. So mothers are making decisions for their children from day one. And that requires that they understand their children's needs, and their children's social relationships. And so, day after day after day, mothering is incredibly cognitively demanding. And the kinds of cognitive skills that are involved are exactly leadership skills. You're making decisions for other people that will hopefully result in good outcomes. So we think selection on these kind of leadership skills actually may have initially began in women making decisions for a cognitively immature offspring, minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day, and that mothers that make better decisions for offsprings obviously would do better reproductively. And then those cognitive abilities then became the basis for leadership skills more general.
So cool. So are these experiments based off of existing anthropological records, or are you conducting your own new experiments and observations to test these?
Yeah, both. So Zachary Garfield is the guy that's been doing all this. And so he started by going through the existing ethnographic record. And so there are literally thousands of documents from all these different cultures around the world for the last couple hundred years. And so Zach did a very extensive survey of existing ethnography to see, do we see these kinds of patterns? Is leadership associated with reputations for knowledge and expertise and intelligence? Yes, it is. Is it associated with getting mating benefits? Yes, it is. But then Zach went into the field with a group of folks in Southwest Ethiopia, the Chabu, who up until the 1970s were hunter-gatherers themselves. Now transition to a horticultural lifestyle. And he began now here he can begin to collect his own data and looking again, who are the leaders in this group? What qualities do they have? What kind of mating success do they have? And he can look at men and women leaders. Often women leadership was ignored in the ethnography before or wasn't seen. So Zach could specifically look for that. And he found that the kinds of traits that are valued in leaders are pretty similar in males and females both. So yeah, he was able to do some of his own original research. So combining existing ethnography with new studies.
Awesome. Ed, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, my pleasure.
All right.